Hello and welcome to the next episode of our Mental Health and Wellbeing in COVID-19 webinar series that we've been bringing to you over the period of the shutdown, the lockdown here in South Africa. I know we have people dialing in from around the world, but we are journeying with you throughout this time in South Africa, specifically through these 21 days. So welcome to today's webinar. Today, let me actually just give Mark a chance to say hi. I often forget about him there.
Hi everyone, lovely to be here with you again.
So this is Mark Baker. He's our resident psychologist on this show, on this webinar, and my name is Theron Nightenford, and I am your host. Today we're going to be discussing something which is really interesting for me. It is something right up my alley. I've shared in a couple of the other webinars that I really believe story is such a vital category or lens for us to understand our own experience as humans. And today we are going to be talking about rewriting your own personal story. Before we do that, let's dive in and do a bit of a recap on what we covered in the last webinar. The key concepts we looked at were understanding that stress is a transaction. We looked at a couple of different models, but where we landed up with a construct that was helpful for understanding stress in a psychological or interactional or relational space is that stress is a transaction. We talked about some coping strategies that move us towards well-being and what emotional and practical coping mechanisms look like. We also had a psychologist who was in the show with us, Dr. Leon Groove, or Dr. Groovy as people call him, a bit of an expert on stress, walking us through some of the dynamics around stress. So that's what we looked at yesterday. The key question we left you with in the previous webinar was to say I guess the theme was how to cope like a legend with the collateral damage of COVID-19. And we gave you a couple of resources and some ways to do that. We chatted you through a daily checklist, which has now become available on the platform and the additional resources, and I'll show that to you later. Talked about trying to increase your positivity ratio, and of course we called back to that ABCDE technique. Okay, Mark, let's dive in. Rewriting your own personal story. Mark's going to chat us through some of these themes for today. How identity comes out of the subconscious, how narrative stories of life really do affect or impact us in our understanding of who we are and how we respond to the world. And then I'm going to dive in a little bit talking about how developing the characters can change the plot line in a time of crisis. So Mark, over to you. Take us away.
Yeah, thanks, Theron. I think, one of the first things I'd like to do is just share a little bit around how our paradigm can shift from experiences that we have and how that paradigm shift can restrict us from responding appropriately to the world around us. And, I'd love us to have a look at some of this research by Martin Seligman. He was studying how we respond to pain, and he ended up discovering something that became known as learned helplessness. He created a two-sided dog kennel, like you can see in front of you here, with the left-hand side having a little shock plate on the bottom, and then right in the middle having a partition that could be opened or closed. And he put the dogs in on the one side, opened the partition, shocked the dogs, and of course they jumped across into the other side to get away from the pain, a very normal response. Then he did the same thing again, but he closed the partition and put the dogs in the side with the shock, and when they realized they couldn't get away from the shock, they would eventually just lie down and take it in the most comfortable way they could find to deal with it. And then something profound happened in his research. When he opened up the partition, in other words, he fixed the structural problem that they were facing in their lives, and he shocked them again. They carried on lying there taking the shock. And this obviously became known as learned helplessness. And why I think that's important for us is that for many of us, even once COVID-19 goes away, we need to go back to facing our lives where we are not restricted anymore. And what we have to see, if you jump onto the next slide, is that essentially there's many paradigms that we carry with us through our personal stories that might not be learned helplessness in terms of a little dog kennel that we were put in and shocked with an open and closed plate, but it might have to do with our gender identity. It might have to do with our ethnicity. It might have to do with the generation we find ourselves in. And particularly for this webinar, we're going to be talking about the story of our lives. And so it's very important for us to start looking at this and considering that the paradigm, the lens through which we view our lives radically impacts on the way we're able to respond to the practical reality of life that's around us. So something that we touched on in one of the previous webinars, I think it was webinar number 2, is the importance of the subconscious mind. And we had a look at this triangle that's behind the arrow there, the difference between the conscious mind and subconscious mind. And we looked at some of the principles of the subconscious mind, that it doesn't pay attention to what's right or wrong, true or false. Sorry, not doesn't pay attention. It can't tell the difference between right or wrong, true or false. It also doesn't interpret words like don't. You know, if I say to you, don't think of a pink elephant, what you think of is a pink elephant, you know. And share just about how some of these principles come from Dr. Peter van Jaarsveld's writing on emotional intelligence. And what I want to share with you today is that, you know, as we go through our lives, we start downloading into our subconscious minds many of the negative incidents from our lives, because remember, the subconscious mind pays more attention to the negative messages than to the positive messages. And our subconscious mind goes through a very interesting process of what's called thematic analysis. It starts summarizing themes from the different incidents in our lives and the stories of our lives. And what rises up out of our subconscious minds is what is called an identity. And I want to just in 30 seconds share with you a few quick incidents from my life and how those were combined into an identity for me. And then I'm going to show you how we start interpreting our lives through that. You know, many of you may have heard through some other webinars that I've shared that I never really knew my father. And growing up without a father gave me a sense that, you know, seeing other people with a father meant that they must have a certain kind of worth because dad was around and was interested in them. My mom was a single mom, and she had to obviously work pretty hard to look after the 2 kids, so she wasn't able to come to sports games. And so I would look around at the other moms that were standing there, many of them housewives, on the side of the rugby field or cricket field, and I would see, well, they obviously are worth watching. I remember, you know, silly incidents like the first time I played guitar for my mom, and her first comment was, you know, it's a little bit out of tune, why don't we tune it? You know, and as I went through life, there were these little moments, some of them radical, like a divorce and not knowing a father, some of them small, like playing a guitar that was out of tune. But my subconscious downloaded the negative messages, and for me, what rose up out of my subconscious mind was an identity of worthlessness. And that started to dominate the way that I viewed the world. And if you jump onto the next slide, the best way that I could describe an identity that we start having through our subconscious minds is through something that I would like to call a subconscious lens. And what typically happens is that we start viewing the world through those identities. In my case, it was worthlessness. And we interpret every circumstance in our lives through that identity of worthlessness. In fact, quite recently, you know, I've been discussing this with my wife, Robin, who we've been just unpacking another layer of the story, the narrative that I've needed to change, where if at times she isn't very responsive to some of my needs, it starts triggering on that worthlessness again. And instead of interpreting some of her behaviors as being, oh, she forgot to make me a cup of coffee, or oh, she was too busy or too tired to help with the dishes, I still sometimes go back to that narrative of worthlessness and interpret the world through it. So I want to jump onto another concept here, and I just want to stop and see if you've got any comments here around these subconscious lenses and how we start interpreting the world through it.
Yeah, I'd love to just offer a little bit of clarification on something that our viewers may be confused about with what you're talking about, that the subconscious doesn't pay attention to negatives or does pay attention. I think just to summarize that, it doesn't tell the difference between negatives and positives. It just stores it as truth, but it's more likely to pay attention to negatives. So the truth that is being stored, according to the subconscious view on it, is mostly going to be negative without the subconscious even realizing it's negative because of the attention we pay. And I think that's so aptly illustrated in your story, that no doubt there were moments when somebody did come to watch your sports game. It doesn't matter. You don't remember that one. You remember the other ones. And the truth, and I use this term loosely because it's not true. You're not worthless. But the truth that your brain tells you about who you are, the identity you have is one of worthless. Hope that's helpful. You want to jump back in?
Yeah, Theron, I mean, that's such a perfect segue into, the next slide that I want to share, which is around, we've mentioned the amygdala or the amygdala a few times. You'll see that bottommost label there in the blue part of the brain. And this is the part of the brain that is responsible essentially for our subconscious memory. And it is constantly filtering the environment around us, looking for threats or anything that might damage us, or anything that might be something that we need to fight, fright, or freeze from, that we need to instinctively respond to. And I want to show you quickly how it works, because what I'd love to illustrate is that some of these identities, these negative identities, exist within a physical part of our brain, and we need to work hard to rewire the story. So let's imagine there's a threat on the outside. In this case, a snake. This is what Daniel Goleman shows in his emotional intelligence book. He uses a snake. But this might be for me playing the guitar song and the thrill of playing my first song. And so it's threatening, and then I take in the negative message. It might be approaching a young lady or a young man when you're interested. But essentially, the eyes take in the information, which goes straight to the thalamus, the call center of the brain, the switchboard of the brain. The thalamus then sends the information out to the cortex, which is that outer part of the brain, to kind of understand the little bits, and then it gets sent through to the back part of the brain, the visual cortex. And this is the part that got damaged during affective blindsight that we touched on a few webinars ago. From there, the information, once it is interpreted, gets sent through to the amygdala to say to us, I'm scared or not, I should run away or not. Now, of course, that's a huge problem. If we encounter a snake or anything dangerous, and it takes us so long to process the information before we realize, I need to get out of here. And so what you can see there in that red arrow between the thalamus and the amygdala is that there's a set of neural pathways that run there, and all that they do is they look for threat and danger in the world around us so we can respond instantly. This is those wildlife videos you've seen, Theron, of the crocodile that tries to chomp the impala, and the impala jumps away before it's even realized anything. This is called an amygdala hijack, where the amygdala is able to take the information and cause an instant response before you have even thought about it. And it is this reason that we referred to in one of the earlier webinars, that 66% or 2/3 of the amygdala is just looking for negative messages. And so you were quite right in what you were saying, that we are more inclined to be absorbing and paying attention to those negative messages. Now, this sounds all like doom and gloom, but let's start picking it up here, Theron, because there's a lot of hope for us. Because as you can see on the next slide, we have been gifted as humans with this part of our brain, the frontal lobes. This is like no other animal in the animal kingdom has got these frontal lobes that are as developed as ours. And they, of course, are responsible for conscious awareness, control over who we are, and free will. And we can use the frontal lobes to be able to take control over some of the emotional centers of the brain. And this is essentially what emotional intelligence is, or what EQ is neurologically. It is the ability to balance what's happening in the frontal lobes and what's happening in the emotional centers of the brain. And so this is what enables change for us. This is why we need to use these very simple but very powerful techniques, like using the activities for the positivity ratio, like the ABCDE technique, helping us to stay away from negative thoughts or irrational thoughts and have more rational thoughts, because we have to force our frontal lobes to start slowly rewiring the negative thematic stories of our lives that have created these identities. And it is possible to rewire these, but it takes constant effort over long periods of time. So would love you to jump in, Theron, because that's just a little bit of the neuroscience and psychology behind how our narratives create our identities. But I think we really are here to talk about why those name tags or identities become so important in our lives.
Yeah, I mean, what's really relevant here, that pulls back to what we've shared in previous webinars, is talking about things like that ABCDE technique, or things that we can do that actually change that neural architecture, change the structures. And that's what you're referring to when you say it takes time, it takes effort. For me, the main takeaway here is that you can actually change that. You can rewrite your interpretation of the story, which is looking backwards. You know, as you shared your story of growing up and some of the dynamics there that led you to a certain identity, or, you know, often the words we use is a name tag that we put on ourselves. This is who I am. You know, look at me this way. This is how I identify. That is because it's been built up like that over time in the story. And through psychology, because of what we know about neurology, through some of these really impressive and important techniques that we can do in the field of positive psychology and emotional intelligence, we can actually go and reinterpret the story, which is a really important part of what it means to rewrite the story going forwards.
Yeah.
But for me, coming as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, there's another element as well that I think is really important to speak to. I said, you know, we developed these name tags, and our name tag really does matter because it gives us the resources to either respond in a way that is going to lead forward into overcoming our challenges, or it's going to lead into just letting the world happen to us and things happening. On the slide, you can see, you know, two different scenarios. You've got the classic, I can't, I'm just and whatever's on your name tag, insert that. I can't, I'm just a girl. I can't, I'm just I never went to university. Or I can't, I'm not the boss. Or whatever the I can't is often driven by that name tag that is in the story, has been created in the story because of what's happening in our brains. But of course, there's other stories. You know, you've got the classic David and Goliath here on the side. I mean, there's something very different about David. In that story, he's got an I can attitude. He doesn't see the giant. He sees his own skills and his own abilities and how he has been prepared for this moment. Now, what's really important is that this leads us into something that I think is going to be very helpful for our viewers, is a story construct called the hero's journey. And I mentioned this in one of the early episodes. I think in the very first episode, we talked about the hero's journey. Now, this comes out of the world of psychoanalysis, actually. The first guy who wrote the book on the hero's journey was drawing on a lot of stuff from the information that had been made available through psychoanalyzing different patients. So this is very much in the realm of psychology. In the hero's journey, I'm not going to walk you through the entire thing. It's just a very quick whirlwind. But there's different elements. There's the hero himself or herself, who is at the center of that story. And you can see top left, there's the mentor. Think of Yoda. Yoda is the mentor to the Jedi, or to Luke Skywalker, whatever. At the top right, you've got tools or weapons that have been given. Here I've just got it as a book of spells, because of course the witch down there at the bottom is the obstacle. That's the challenge. That is what the hero has to overcome. But then on the bottom left there, you can see there's a group of cheerleaders cheering him on. And that's because every great story has companions. They have people. Think of the Lord of the Rings. It's the fellowship that travels with Frodo as he takes the ring. The mentor in that story would be Gandalf. And of course the witch is Sauron, or any other of the trolls or other things that he encounters along the way. In that story in particular, he gets this chainmail is part of his tools that help him. He's given gifts from the elves, all sorts of things to help him in the journey. What's relevant for us in this webinar is the fact that there are people in the life of the hero. There are mentors, and there are people surrounding you. And so much of what happens in the hero's journey, in the hero's life, is that actually so often, right at the beginning of every good story, the hero rejects the call to adventure. There is a challenge that is brought, and the hero says, no, I can't, I'm just a whatever. I'm just a hobbit, I can't do it. And what we see as we track through a story is that heroes grow. And the reason, and this has been touched on from so many different fields of academics, the reason stories are compelling for us is because we recognize ourselves in the hero. We see that we have these challenges, and then we see that there is help that is given. There are tools that are given to help us overcome the challenges. And as the hero journeys and grows, we as the viewer or the listener to the story, we say, yes, go, overcome, because that's what we want to do in our own lives.
Yeah.
Now, as we look at this theme of how do we rewrite our story, well, we do it in a couple of different ways. As Marcus mentioned, we do it psychologically. There are tools, there are techniques that have been benchmarked and worked on, and we've been making those resources available to you. You can think of that as your book of spells or your magic sword. Those things are there to help you in the journey, but there are people as well in your journey. And what's interesting now is that we are in a dynamic where the people around us may be different people to normal, and our friends may not be as close as they used to be. We can't just pop over to their house, but we still have digital means of communicating. We're still trying to remote work. We still have access to people. And so much of rewriting what the story looks like is actually about rewriting what the character looks like. And the people around you help you to do that. So we're going to dive into a section now where we're going to actually have another guest on the show. I forgot to mention right at the beginning that we have a guest today. Anyway, we're about to jump into that interview right now. So, Sarika, can you hear us? So we have a guest with us today, Sarika Thakur. She is an organizational psychologist who works at a company called NetSurant. Hi, Sarika. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks so much.
Really excited to have you today and for you to share a little bit about the themes that we're discussing today. But before we go any further, is there anything else we should know about you? What's interesting about you? Tell us something.
Well, I must say, although people's my big passion, I'm also a bit of a science geek, so that's something a lot of people don't know about me. So yeah.
Okay. You're a psychologist scientist. This is a good combo.
Yeah.
It's a good combo. Okay, the reason we have Sarika on the call today is particularly because of an initiative that they have at their work at NetSurant, which has been, I think, really it dovetails nicely with these themes. Something called the Dreams Program. Could you tell us this webinar, of course, isn't about the Dreams Program, but just tell us in 1 minute, what is this Dreams Program and what does it look like at your work?
Awesome. Yeah. So the Dreams Program is actually an initiative that our CEO started over 20 years ago. Of course, we all know the link between engagement and happy people make happy workplaces and productive. But for that reason, there was a passion about having a mechanism in our company where it's for the people to keep our staff engaged and focusing on people's dreams. So what I like about what you guys have been sharing so far is that process and mechanism to write your own story, and we have a whole program around that, and we give a lot of support through a group coaching mechanism and different tools to instill everyday habits that can really challenge your thinking, your stories, your underlying stories, and help you get to you achieving your dreams and goals. So that's what our Dreams Program is about, and we invest a lot into that.
It sounds very much like it is a very personally focused program. It's not what are your dreams for the third quarter. It's what are your dreams for you as a person?
100%. There isn't anything really work related unless an individual decides to put that in if they have a personal growth goal within the company. But it's 100% individually focused, personal. Nothing really to do with work.
Yeah, awesome. And I remember reading in the documentation you sent through that I think I understand that it's voluntary, but actually the buy-in is almost unanimous. The whole company is bought into this.
100%. Of course, when you come into an organization, you buy into the culture and the ethos and the way you do it. And the Dreams Program is a big part of that. Being an individual, focusing on your dreams, achieving those is a big part of what we do. So we've got people just buy into it. It's awesome.
That's great. I mean, I think it's amazing to hear that it's 20 years old, by the way, just as an aside, because it's the kind of thing that we're seeing. It's the kind of investment we're seeing more and more in different corporates, investment into their people. So it sounds like you guys are a bit of an early adopter in this kind of realm and perhaps a leader in it. But what's fascinating for me is that the link between what we've been chatting about so far in the webinar is the past, looking backwards, reinterpreting the story that has gone till now. And so often what can happen in that psychological process is you move from the I can't because I'm just you move from that to the no, I can, and I can accomplish that. I can get rid of that giant. I can take this ring to the fires of Mordor and throw it in there. It's very much a future. It's rewriting the past and the name tags for the sake of the future, which is very much in the space where the Dreams Program sort of lands, I think. I'd love to know from your experience dealing with people as an organizational psychologist with a program like this at work. What impact have you seen in the lives of the people there at work as they start seeing their own potential to reach these dreams? What are you seeing? And obviously this webinar is not about how to improve the bottom line or how to get productivity or how to reduce absenteeism. That's not what this is about. Those things I think play into it. But what have you seen in a very practical, personal sense, that the impact of helping people write a positive story going forward, what impact has that had on the lives of the people?
So, I mean, obviously we all know, introspection is a big part of your own personal journey and what you need to do to rewrite that past and your identity. But I think what I've seen the biggest impact is, as you mentioned in your story, and Mark, having those people in your life to challenge that personal identity of I'm just X, or I can't do this and because I'm not good enough, as an example. And I think through this sort of mechanism, surrounding yourselves with people, talking about your dreams and your goals and listening to each other, you can really then start questioning, well, no, it's not that I won't be able to achieve X, Y, and Z or take the ring to Mordor or whatever it is. I can do it. Firstly, because maybe, as you said, somebody in the circle around you has done similar, or you can relate to that person. So that gives you inspiration to challenge your own beliefs, and as well as getting that encouragement from other people to say, but why can't you achieve that? I've seen you do X, Y, and Z, or challenge your thinking in that way. So for me, that's been the very big impact of having something like that.
Yeah, so it's not just the techniques which we can do to do internal work to change that internal identity. It's actually feedback from outside that can speak to that identity and say, why don't you think you can do that thing? Of course you can do that. I've seen you do this, etc. It's the help. It's the help of the mentor and the companions. Essentially, it's Sam walking so closely with Frodo as he's hit, and when he gets to that point, he's like, I can't do this, and Frodo's like, and Sam is saying, oh, we can do this. You can do this. Such an important part. Now, what's really relevant, I guess, for this moment that we're in right now, is that we're not at work. So you've got this program at work, right? But we're not there, we're at home. We're dealing with other things. Perhaps some of our insecurities are coming up in this new context. Why didn't they include me in on the Zoom call? Am I not valuable enough for this process at work? Like nobody even knows that I'm not doing something, or like where's the accountability? Oh, obviously I don't matter. Whatever those kind of triggers are that may be happening to people. I'd love to hear what kind of impact you think taking this kind of approach to really having a very positive focused future lens on the story, as well as doing all of these techniques and the psychological work. How can that apply to us now in this season?
So I think, I know one of the previous episodes mentioned the importance of relationships, and I think it links very much here in terms of reaching out into your immediate circle, whether it's your partner at home or your friend online. I mean, there's so many, we live in a very privileged sense of being able to connect digitally. There's a house party, WhatsApp call, you name it. So my advice would be to use those channels and connect with people around you. But maybe a tip of bringing what the Dreams program is being very focused. So saying, guys, why don't we talk about what some of your goals and dreams are, so we keep that alive in this time of uncertainty and anxiety and whatever it might be. And I think in that way, it will definitely enhance our thinking and challenging our beliefs and not allowing us to slip back maybe into some of that old thinking during these times of uncertainty.
And even just it replaces the big monster of COVID-19. That's when my kid said to me this morning, he said, Dad, can we not talk about the coronavirus today? Like, that's literally what he said to me this morning. Because CNN is on all the time. He's like, I'm tired of it. So it's not just rewriting your own personal story, it's actually rewriting your own personal story by imagining a brighter future, not one where we've all died from coronavirus. So I think that's super helpful. Thank you so much for your input today, Sarika. Thanks for being on the show with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Wow, so what a great interview. It sounds really exciting what they're doing there. Is there anything you'd like to add to what we've just heard?
Yeah, I was just so encouraged hearing that there are leaders in companies that are doing this kind of thing, Theron. And what stood out for me from what Sarika was saying was really that, there's this journey that we're all on together. It's the journey of our lives, And it's for many of us, so many parts of that journey where we're trying to rewrite the story. And because we're all on it together, I think there's a joy for others when we lean on them, for them to actually help us along our way. And that really stood out for me. Yeah.
Well, listen, one of the things we have been making available to you, if you are a subscriber to this webinar, is access to our platform. And I hope that this can be a magic book of spells or a sword to help you in your journey. Go to www.mygrow.me and you can sign up for the COVID-19 free trial. Of course, in the actual platform, there's a tab, and you can go there and you can look for the additional resources and the replays of each webinar. Mark, you were just going to chat through a little bit on those additional resources. What can you tell us about those?
Yeah, I think, all 4 of these that are on there at the moment will just help people to rewrite their story. The first one on the left is just an overview of the total webinar series. The next one is, that positivity ratio activity list. The next one is a whole overview of how to do the ABCDE technique. And the last one is the daily checklist that people can use every morning to really start their day off well and head towards well-being.
Great. Well, thanks very much again for being with us. We look forward to the next webinar. You may be at home alone, you may be with others, but we're all in this together, and we all have the power to rewrite the story of the past and to rewrite the story of the future. Thanks very much. We will see you in the next webinar.
Cheers.